The darkness in this house always seemed thicker than anywhere else. It didn't just hide corners. It breathed, filling every crack with icy fear. Dexter Collins woke up suddenly, as if someone had called him. The room was quiet, but something had changed. He could feel it with every fiber of his being. Lying in bed, he stared intently into the darkness. Moonlight barely filtered through the blinds, casting eerie shadows on the ceiling. A deep, wary breath. The air in the room was thick, like before a storm. He reached for the phone on the bedside table. 3:12 a.m., the dead of night, when the city falls silent, and the world sinks into the hazy boundary between sleep and reality. But what woke him up? Dexter sat up, leaning against the cold headboard, and listened. There was no sound in the house except for the steady ticking of the clock in the hallway. Yet inside, something screamed. Intuition, that trembling nerve that had never failed him at a crime scene. He ran a hand over his face, shaking off the remnants of sleep. Then he slowly got out of bed and walked to the window. With each step, the wooden floor creaked unpleasantly, as if the house itself was warning him. The curtains rustled slightly from the night breeze. Outside, it was empty. The narrow street in front of the house was still, the street light by the neighbor's house flickering as if struggling to stay alive. But a few moments ago, he could have sworn he saw a silhouette, a tall figure standing right in front of his house. He blinked. No one. Taking a deep breath, Dexter was about to close the window when he noticed something strange. On the glass from the inside, there was a faint trace, as if someone had just breathed on it. He turned around sharply. An empty room. Only silence. At that moment, the front door slammed downstairs. Freezing, he tried to catch any sounds. His heart pounded dully, like a drum. Someone was in the house. He slowly reached for the bedside table where his gun lay, but it was empty. He had forgotten to load it since he moved here. Footsteps, heavy, cautious, on the wooden floor of the first floor. Every muscle in his body tensed. Someone was here. His consciousness instantly cleared, his body remembering everything he had once learned. How to move, how to assess a threat, how to fight if necessary. The footsteps stopped right under the stairs. Dexter stepped back into the darkness of the room, holding his breath. Downstairs, there was a rustling sound, as if someone was fiddling with papers on the table in the living room. Then a sound, soft, drawn out, unpleasant, like nails scratching on wood. Dexter knew he had to act. He quietly moved along the wall, feeling the roughness of the wallpaper with his fingertips. When he reached the door, the footsteps sounded again, slow, measured, climbing the stairs. Whoever it was, they knew Dexter was here. Last chance to run or face whoever came. But before he could make a decision, the phone on the bedside table lit up. The soft sound of a notification cut through the night silence. Dexter froze. He slowly turned his head and looked at the screen. A message from an unknown number. Just 3 words. "You do remember?" Dexter didn't move. He just stared at the phone screen where the 3 words glowed. "You do remember." The stranger's footsteps on the stairs froze. Someone was standing there a few meters away from him, in the darkness. Seconds stretched like red-hot metal. His fingers trembled as he took the phone off the bedside table, not taking his eyes off the doorway. His mind raced. Who could have sent this message? What did they want? Then another sound. Slow, deliberate. One step, another. Dexter pressed himself against the wall, his heart pounding against his ribs. The door hinges creaked. He didn't wait. With one quick movement, he grabbed the heavy table lamp and threw it at the doorway. There was a dull thud. Someone cursed and staggered back. Time. He needed time. Dexter lunged forward, not distinguishing details. The corridor was narrow, but he knew every inch of this house. He leaned down, darted down the stairs, jumping over 2 steps at a time. His back was sweaty from tension, but he didn't stop until he was on the first floor. The front door, locked. His fingers slid over the lock. But at that moment, a sound came from above. Laughter. Soft, barely audible. Unnatural. Dexter froze, his hand still on the lock. What the hell? The laughter stopped, but in the darkness upstairs, something moved. He couldn't see the face of the person standing there, but he felt their gaze burning through him. Dexter took a step back, then another. His vision darkened. Reality seemed to crack, like glass under blows. Flashes before his eyes, scenes from the past. Someone's hands covered in blood. Wet asphalt. Red flashing lights. A whisper in the night. "You do remember?" Number he didn't remember. "What do you want?" His voice broke. Silence. And then the stranger spoke. His voice was low, but there was a strange, painful cheerfulness in it. "You know." Dexter felt a chill run down his spine. And suddenly, a knock. Loud, sharp. Not from the house. From the window. Dexter turned his head sharply. Outside, right under the streetlight, stood a girl. Thin, with long dark hair. Her face was hidden in shadow, but even from a distance, he felt that she was looking straight at him. And he recognized her, although he couldn't remember from where. Something deep in his consciousness stirred, came to life. He took a step forward. The girl slowly pressed a finger to her lips. Shh. And then she disappeared, in an instant, as if she had never stood there. Dexter froze, and upstairs in the darkness of the staircase landing, the stranger laughed again. Dexter slowly exhaled, trying to suppress the growing panic. Inside, everything demanded movement, but his body was frozen by a cold paralysis. Upstairs, the footsteps sounded again. The stranger was in no hurry. What to do? He looked around. Open the door. Number windows. Most were tightly locked. Run? Where? And then his gaze fell on the kitchen table. A knife. His mind suggested an image, his fingers gripping the cold handle. Something stirred in his chest. He didn't remember, but his body moved on its own. The next moment, Dexter was already standing at the table, holding a long carving knife. His breathing was ragged, but his gaze was clear. The footsteps stopped. "Interesting choice," the voice from above drawled. "But you won't do it, will you?" Dexter didn't answer. Silence stretched. And then, a slow, almost lazy descent downstairs. One step, another. He saw the silhouette appear in the doorway. Tall, thin, with an unnatural relaxedness in his movements. In the semi-darkness, his face was indistinguishable, but Dexter felt that it was familiar to him. "Where from? Why are you silent?" The stranger took another step forward. "You don't really forget, do you?" In his temples, it hummed again. Wet asphalt, hands covered in blood, screams. Number he didn't remember. "Stay back," Dexter hissed. "Oh, but you're not afraid of me, are you?" The man's voice was almost tender. "You're afraid of yourself." He took another step. Dexter gripped the knife. And at that moment, there was another knock at the window. Loud, demanding. He jerked, his gaze darting to the glass. The girl. She was standing there, just like before. But now the streetlight was shining on her face. And he knew that face. Sarah. Something in his head snapped, breaking with such force that he almost fell to his knees. "You do remember, Dexter?" Her voice had trembled then. "They mustn't know. No one must know. Sarah!" He didn't recognize his own voice. "What did we do?" Blood on his hands. The two of them. Rain washing away the traces. Someone screams in the distance. The girl's eyes met his again, and he understood. He wasn't the one who should be afraid of whoever was standing in the darkness, but of who he was then. Dexter looked back. There was no one in the doorway anymore. Only a shadow slipping into the darkness of the corridor. Only silence, and only his own heart pounding wildly in his chest. The silence was oppressive. Dexter stood in the center of the kitchen, gripping the knife so tightly that his fingers turned white. His heart was pounding in his chest, his breath coming in short gasps. Sarah. She was here. He slowly turned his head to the window. But she was no longer there. As if a shadow dissolving into the night. A noise. Somewhere behind him, in the depths of the house, something rustled. Dexter turned around. The darkness of the corridor yawned like a black void. Just don't go there. But his feet were already moving on their own. Step, another. The air in the house seemed thick, stale, like in a basement that hadn't been opened in years. He cautiously stepped over the threshold of the corridor. The linoleum under his feet creaked. There was something ahead. Dexter could feel it with his spine. Behind the door. He remembered it. It was always locked. Even when he was a child, his father forbade him to go near it. "Don't go in there, Dexter." But now the door was ajar, and a cold draft was coming from it. Dexter slowly reached out and pushed the door. He stepped inside. Darkness enveloped him. It was old, wooden, the steps creaking under each step. He descended slowly, feeling the cold seeping under his skin. A smell, dampness, dust, and something else. Something familiar. Dexter couldn't remember the last time he went down there. Or did he remember? The light from his phone illuminated outlines from the darkness. Shelves with boxes, cobweb-covered shelves, and a chair. Right in the center of the room. There were ropes on it and stains on the floor. Dexter froze. Number. You don't want to remember this, but the memory was already surfacing from the depths. Cold, fear, hands holding his wrists, someone crying, and a voice, deep, harsh. "You know what to do. You know what to do, Dexter." He shuddered, dropping the phone. The screen flickered and went out. Darkness enveloped him, and in that darkness, something moved. Dexter froze. His heart was beating somewhere in his throat, pounding loudly in his ears. He stood in pitch darkness, and he was not alone. Something was breathing nearby, deeply, hoarsely, as if someone was trying to hold back their voice but couldn't stop themselves. A step behind his back. Dexter quickly turned around, trying to see anything, but only darkness was before his eyes. Where was the phone? He felt the cold concrete floor, his fingers sliding over something sticky. Don't think about it. Finally, he found the phone and pressed the button. Light. The beam cut through the darkness and illuminated someone in the corner of the room. A figure stood, staring at him with empty eye sockets. Old clothes, torn pants, a shirt frozen in a strange pose. Dexter couldn't tell if this person was breathing or if it was just his imagination. But one thing was clear. It was a child, about 10 years old. The face was deathly pale, the skin covered in dirt stains. But the most terrible thing, the lips. They were moving, as if saying something soundlessly. Dexter took a step back. The floor creaked. The child raised his head. Now he was looking straight at him. The eyes, empty, dark, bottomless. And then Dexter heard it, a whisper. Hundreds of voices whispering right into his head. "You were here. You know. Remember. Remember." Dexter covered his ears, but the sound didn't go away. His heart was pounding. He was gasping for breath, not understanding what was reality and what wasn't. And suddenly, darkness enveloped him again. He came to on the cold floor. His head was pounding. His hands were shaking. The light from his phone was working again, but the figure was gone. Only emptiness. Only dust and dampness. But he knew. Someone was here, and he remembered. Dexter lay on the cold floor, breathing heavily. His head was pounding. His temples were being squeezed as if by a vice. But the most terrible thing was not that. He remembered. Fragments of the past which had been hiding in the depths of his consciousness for so long suddenly burst out. They didn't form a complete picture, but he knew one thing. This house, it wasn't just a place. He had been here before. The phone in his hand had heated up. The screen was flickering, as if it was about to turn off. Dexter got up on his knees, trying to focus his gaze. The light illuminated the walls of the basement again, crumbling, cracked, covered in mold. But something had changed. In the far corner, he saw an old cabinet. It wasn't there before, but he definitely remembered it. The same one, massive, with carved patterns on the doors that resembled faces. Dexter slowly stood up. Step, another. With each movement, the room seemed to close in around him. The air became heavier, and the closer he got, the stronger he felt the pressure. Not physical, but something deeper, something in his very consciousness. He reached out and touched the cabinet. His hand trembled. He grabbed the handle. There was no lock. The doors yielded easily, and inside, darkness. Deep, thick, as if it wasn't just a shadow but an endless abyss. But a moment later his eyes opened to something else. There was a staircase, old, steep, leading down. But it was impossible. The basement was the lowest level of the house. There couldn't be a second basement. Dexter swallowed. His body tensed, his instincts screaming at him to run. But something in him, that forgotten something, urged him to go further. He turned on the flashlight on his phone and took a step. The staircase stretched down longer than it should have. It seemed like he was descending not into a basement, but deeper, under the earth, to something ancient. His steps echoed in the void. On the walls, illuminated by the faint light of the phone, there were scratches. Not just random lines, they were words. "Remember? They are waiting. You left us." Dexter shuddered. His fingers tightened on the phone, but he couldn't stop. He knew that if he didn't reach the end, he would remain trapped between reality and nightmares. And finally he arrived. Before him was a door, old wooden, with an iron bolt. On it was his name, carved roughly but clearly, Dexter. He had been called here before, and he had been here before. His hand reached for the lock on its own. A deep breath, a tug. The door swung open, and he saw them. Dexter froze on the threshold. Behind the door, there was no room, no basement, no familiar outlines of space. There was only emptiness. But not endless and not dark, but filled with something alive. The air inside was thick, as if viscous, and moved, pulsating, as if it was not air, but breath. Dexter stepped inside. They were waiting for him. Flashes, like a lightning strike in his consciousness. Suddenly images flooded before his eyes. A woman's face, frightened, in tears. Her lips were whispering something, but there was no sound. The staircase, the same one, leading down, but now covered in blood. Small hands stained with dirt. Distorted figures emerging from the darkness, without eyes, without faces, but watching. Dexter sharply exhaled, clutching his temples. No! These memories couldn't be his, but he remembered. The darkness suddenly thickened in front of him, and out of it emerged them, tall, thin, covered in something like cracked skin, like parchment stretched over bones. They had no mouths, no eyes, but Dexter felt their gazes. They moved slowly with an unnatural sway, as if remembering how to walk, and all together they whispered, "You have come. You left us. Now you remember." Dexter stepped back. "Who are you?" His voice broke, turning into a hoarse whisper. But they didn't answer. They continued to approach. The flashlight in his hand flickered. The light reflected off their smooth faces. And then he saw something strange on the floor. A drawing, drawn with chalk or something else. Symbols. A circle. Words. The same ones that were on the walls of the staircase. And in the center of this circle, something shiny. Metal. A key. Dexter lunged forward. They rushed at him at the same time, their movements becoming sharp, jerky, as if they now remembered how to hunt. He grabbed the key. The world exploded with light. The darkness dissipated like smoke. Sounds ceased. Dexter blinked and realized that he was back in the basement. The cabinet behind him was gone. Only dust remained on the floor, and in his hand, a key, old, darkened with time, with a single letter engraved on it, M. He didn't know what this key opened, but he knew one thing. The door he was approaching, it was already waiting, and it would let him in. Dexter stood before a massive door at the end of the corridor. The key in his hand was heavy, cold, as if it was draining the last remnants of his resolve. Behind him, the sound of wind, like the whisper of the past, from which there was no escape. He took a deep breath, inserted the key into the keyhole, and turned. There was a click, soft, but it echoed in his chest with a pulsating echo. The door creaked open, revealing darkness. The first thing that came was the smell, a mixture of dust, rotting wood, and something metallic, almost rusty. Then, a faint light, drops falling somewhere in the depths. But the main thing, the feeling that he was not alone. "Come in, Dexter." A voice, whispering, familiar, but as if pulled from the very darkness of his memory. He took a step forward, feeling the air around him becoming denser. In the light of a single lamp, the outlines of a room appeared before him. It was his room. Not the one he had lived in for the past few years, but the one he remembered as a child. A wooden bed with a faded blanket, a toy airplane on the floor, an old lamp with a crack in the shade. But something was wrong. "This is impossible," he whispered. On the floor, among the toys, lay a black and white photograph. He recognized it immediately. Himself, with his mother. But his mother, her face in the photo was blurred, as if someone had intentionally erased it. "Why are you here, Dexter?" The voice spoke again. Now he understood. Not just a voice. It was him. Dexter turned around. In the mirror opposite stood not him. The man was similar, but his features were blurred, like an old portrait that someone had tried to erase but couldn't completely. Eyes, black holes pulling into the void. "Who are you?" he exhaled. The figure took a step forward. "Your choice, Dexter. Your memory. Your lie." The room began to change. The floor disappeared. The furniture dissolved into darkness. Only the mirror remained. Dexter took a step back, but something grabbed his wrist. "Don't go. It's not time yet." His own hand, his own voice. Darkness enveloped him. Dexter didn't know how much time had passed. It seemed like the world he had lived in had crumbled to dust, leaving behind only gray shadows of memories. The car slowly rolled down the highway, the headlights cutting through the night darkness, but it seemed like they didn't illuminate the road, but got lost in the void. Cassandra sat in the passenger seat, clutching an old tattered notebook to her chest. She didn't speak, but Dexter felt her tension, like an electric field stretched between them. "Are you sure you want to go back there?" she finally asked, breaking the grave silence. Dexter gripped the steering wheel. The question was rhetorical. Of course, he didn't want to go back, but he had no choice. The Blackwoods house. Their surname sounded like a curse in his head. The old mansion, standing on the border between the forest and the swamps, had always seemed to him something unreal, a place that existed beyond the boundaries of the ordinary world. But now he had to go back there to find out the truth. "They know we're coming," Cassandra said, looking at him intently. Dexter nodded. The closer they got to the old estate, the denser the fog became, as if nature itself was trying to hide it from their eyes. The branches of the trees bent under the weight of the night's dampness, and the road became narrower, as if they were being drawn into the mouth of something alive. Once this place was bustling. Dozens of cars, servants, loud conversations on the balconies, laughter at the tables. Now it was silent. The Blackwood estate stood in anticipation, like a beast crouching before a pounce. Cassandra gripped his hand. "If something goes wrong—" "Everything will go wrong," he interrupted her. He got out of the car, the door slamming shut, cutting through the dense night. On the porch stood two figures. One of them, Richard Blackwood, a tall man with graying temples and eyes as cold as ice. Next to him, Mary Blackwood, his sister, dressed in a dark dress, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You still decided to come?" Richard's voice was low and hoarse, as if he knew this day would come. "It seems I had no choice," Dexter replied. Inside, everything was as he remembered. The clock on the wall, the rustling floor underfoot, the faint smell of cigars and wood. But there was an unnatural silence in the air. "We knew you would come," Mary said, leading them to an old table. "The past always returns." Richard ran his hand over the polished surface of the table. "Do you want to know the truth?" Dexter nodded. "Then listen." He reached into the table drawer and pulled out an old folder with documents. In its faded papers lay a story that no one spoke aloud. "Everything that happened to you, it's not an accident. It was all planned long before your birth, Dexter." A shiver ran down his spine. "What do you mean?" Richard opened the folder and spread out a photograph in front of him. In the picture were his parents, but next to them stood a man who shouldn't have been in that photo. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice sounding like an echo. Richard squinted. "The one who started it all." Dexter swallowed. His past, his memories, it was all a lie. And now he stood before those who knew the truth. Only one question remained. Did he want to hear it? A heavy silence hung in the room. The lamp on the table flickered, casting trembling shadows on the walls, as if they too were witnesses to everything that was happening. Dexter couldn't take his eyes off the photograph. "Who is he?" he repeated, his voice sounding foreign to him. Richard looked at him as if deciding whether to continue. Then he slowly turned his gaze to Mary, and she barely nodded. "His name was Jonathan Crawford," Richard finally answered. The name meant nothing to Dexter. He looked at the photo again. His parents looked the way he remembered them. His father with a warm smile, his mother with thoughtful, gentle eyes. But this man, tall, gaunt, with sharp features, looked straight into the camera with an expression that made him shudder. "Who was he to me?" Dexter asked, feeling a chill run down his spine. "He was your real father," Richard said calmly. Cassandra sharply inhaled. Dexter didn't immediately understand what had been said to him. His real father? "This must be some mistake," he said. "My parents, they were your parents, but not by blood. Rather, they were your parents, but not your real parents." Mary interrupted, her voice soft, almost soothing. "Your real father was Jonathan Crawford." Dexter froze. "Then, who am I?" he asked quietly. Richard looked him straight in the eye. "You are the heir of Crawford." Dexter felt the world he knew crumbling around him. "That's impossible." He stepped back, his breath catching. "Crawford, they disappeared," Richard finished for him. "But not all." Dexter paused. "What do you mean?" Richard leaned back in his chair and wearily rubbed his forehead. "Jonathan Crawford was part of something very dangerous, and he did everything to hide you from those who were hunting him. He gave you to the Blackwoods, our parents, so you would grow up under a different name, so no one would know who you really are." Cassandra looked at Dexter as if seeing him for the first time. "So, we are being chased because of you," she whispered. Dexter clenched his fists. What did he do? Why are they after me? Richard hesitated. He knew too much about an organization, and they couldn't let that knowledge die with him. Dexter swallowed. What organization? Richard looked at him with a hint of regret. The Order of the Black Sun, Cassandra quietly cursed. That's impossible. The Black Sun is just a legend. Do you really think so? Mary asked softly. Cassandra froze. Dexter felt a cold grip in his chest. The Order of the Black Sun, mentioned only in the darkest corners of history. Conspiracies, disappearances, secret societies controlling the world from the shadows. But if Richard was to be believed, if he was the son of a man who was part of all this, then why am I still alive? He finally asked. Richard leaned forward. Because they want you to come to them yourself. Dexter felt the world crumbling beneath his feet again. What? They never kill those who can be useful to them, Richard continued. They wait, and when you're ready, you'll come to them yourself. Dexter froze. The order was waiting for him. The question was, what was he going to do next? Dexter stood motionless, feeling the icy silence growing inside him. He had always known that there was something in his life that didn't add up. Some minor inconsistencies, strange looks from people who knew his parents. Now he understood why. He had never been who he thought he was. And what am I supposed to do now? His voice sounded surprisingly calm. Richard looked at him intently, as if trying to gauge how far he was willing to go. You have two options, he finally answered. You can continue to live as you have, pretend you know nothing, but sooner or later, they will find you. Dexter swallowed. And the second, find them first. Cassandra abruptly stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. This is insane, her eyes darted between them, like a cornered animal. We just survived an attack. We were almost killed. And you, she pointed at Dexter, you want to find the people behind it? He looked at her and realized that for the first time in a long time, he felt right. They won't stop, he said quietly. You know that yourself. But you don't understand who you're dealing with, she exclaimed. These aren't some drug dealers, not some corrupt cops. This is the Order of the Black Sun. These are people who move the world according to their own script. If they want someone erased, that person is never found again. Then I have another question. Dexter's voice was calm, but inside him a growing resolve was breaking through. If they are so powerful, why am I still alive? Cassandra froze. Richard nodded approvingly. And I have another question. Dexter's voice was calm, but inside him a growing resolve was breaking through. If they are so powerful, why am I still alive? Cassandra froze. Richard nodded approvingly. Exactly. He pulled a silver lighter from his pocket and flicked it open. They could have eliminated you as a child, but they didn't. They could have killed you at any moment, but they chose not to. This means you have something they need. Dexter took a deep breath. What? Richard smiled. Let's find out. Let's find out. Cassandra shook her head. You're both crazy. Maybe, Dexter looked at her, but I'm not going to hide for the rest of my life. She rolled her eyes and sat back down. Fine. Suppose we go down this path. Where do we start? Richard pulled a folded sheet of paper from his pocket and tossed it onto the table. With this, Dexter unfolded the paper. It was an old, faded map, but not an ordinary one. Strange symbols ran along its edges, which he couldn't immediately decipher. In the center stood a sign resembling an ancient seal. What is this? One of the last traces of your father. He hid something in a certain place. I found out that the map contains encrypted coordinates. Dexter ran his finger over the yellowed surface. Where? Richard smiled. In the very heart of their empire. Cassandra looked at him as if he had just announced they were going to the moon. Wait, are you saying we need to get into the Order's headquarters? Not necessarily, Richard calmly replied, but very close. Dexter looked at him, feeling a cold fire ignite within him. Then we need to start. Dusk was slowly descending upon the city when Dexter, Cassandra, and Richard left the safety of the house behind. Ahead of them lay a journey into the very heart of darkness, to the place where it all began. They sped down the night road, surrounded by endless shadows, and the silence in the car felt oppressive. No one spoke, but each knew there was no turning back. Tell me everything you know. Dexter finally broke the silence. Richard nodded, continuing to focus intently on the road. The Order of the Black Sun is not just a group of fanatics or a criminal organization. It is a cult hiding in the shadows of the world's elite. They do not just control power, they govern history itself. Cassandra crossed her arms. Nicely put, but let's get to the point. Richard sighed. Long ago, long before any of us were born, the Order began searching for an artifact that, according to legend, could give its owner the power to change reality. This artifact was called the Crawford Seal. Dexter froze. Crawford? Richard nodded. Yes, it's not just your father's last name. It is a code name passed down from generation to generation. Your father was the last to know where the seal was hidden, and now the only clue we have is this map. He nodded toward the folded sheet of paper lying on the dashboard. Dexter ran his hand over his face, trying to process what he had heard. And you think the Order is hunting me because I might find it first? Richard smiled. I don't think. I'm sure. Cassandra frowned. And where, in your opinion, is it hidden? Richard paused before answering. In one of the oldest buildings in the city, in a mansion known to the locals as Crawford House. Dexter felt his heart race. He had heard of this place, an abandoned mansion on the outskirts, once home to the most influential families. Now people avoided it, considering it cursed. There could be traps, Cassandra muttered. Or worse. I know. Richard turned the wheel, veering off the highway. But if we don't find the seal first, the Order will... They remained silent as the road led them to massive iron gates. Behind them, shrouded in darkness, stood the house, tall with a sagging roof and windows like empty eye sockets. Perfect place to die, Cassandra muttered. Dexter took a deep breath. Then let's make sure it's not our death. They slipped inside through a broken window. The air was thick with the scent of decay and dust. Moonlight filtered through cracked glass, casting eerie patterns on the walls. Richard pulled out a flashlight and illuminated a long corridor. "We need to go downstairs," he said. "Why downstairs?" Cassandra looked around. "If I'm right, your father didn't hide the seal in a visible place," Richard explained. "He hid it where no one would look, in the catacombs beneath the house." Dexter felt the tension building inside him. "Then let's go." They moved forward cautiously, the floor creaking under their feet, the walls breathing cold. Every sound echoed as if the house was watching them. And then, a rustle. Cassandra froze. Was that the wind? But Dexter knew. It wasn't the wind. Richard slowly raised his weapon. "We're not alone." In the darkness beyond the corner of the corridor, something moved. Dexter steadied his grip on the pistol, his heart pounding like a drumbeat. Something was moving in the darkness ahead. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, aiming his flashlight down the corridor. Shadows flickered. "Who's there?" he whispered. No response came, only a faint, barely perceptible rustle. Cassandra raised her shotgun, her fingers white on the trigger. "It could just be a rat," Richard tried to reassure them, but his voice was tense. And then, a voice, deep, ominous, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You're too late." Dexter spun around but saw no one. "Who's there?" Silence. Richard raised his flashlight higher, its beam revealing an ancient portrait hanging on the wall. The face in the painting was smudged, as if someone had tried to erase it. "We need to get downstairs," he said. "I don't want to find out who we're dealing with here." The staircase led down into the basement, shrouded in the cobwebs of time. The scent of dampness and old decay filled their nostrils. Cassandra was the first to step onto the lower landing. "Classic haunted basement," she muttered, looking around. "Where do we look now?" Richard moved to the far wall, carefully examining the masonry. "There should be a passage somewhere here." He pressed his hand against one of the stones and pushed. It gave way with a soft click. A dull grating sound echoed through the basement. A gap appeared in the wall, revealing a hidden passage leading downward, deeper into the darkness. "Catacombs," Dexter breathed. Cassandra aimed her flashlight into the opening, revealing steep stone steps descending into a black abyss. "Great! It just keeps getting worse." They stepped into the passage, and the darkness closed in behind them. The catacombs proved to be far more ancient than they appeared. Winding stone corridors stretched into the unknown. The walls were inscribed with strange symbols that Dexter couldn't decipher. "This isn't just a basement," he muttered. "It's a temple." Richard nodded. "The Order used it centuries ago. They conducted their rituals here." Dexter felt a chill run down his spine. Cassandra crouched by one of the walls, tracing the inscriptions with her fingers. "This is Latin," she said. "Mortem venit ad omnes." Death comes to all. "Charming," Richard quipped. They ventured further. Soon the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. It was an enormous space hidden beneath the earth for centuries. At its center stood an altar of black stone. Above it hung an ancient crest, and Dexter recognized it immediately. This is my father's mark," his voice trembled. Richard placed a hand on his shoulder. "Yes, and that means the seal must be here." Dexter took a step forward but abruptly stopped. Something wasn't right. Cassandra sensed it too. She raised her shotgun, her eyes darting through the shadows. "We're not alone." From the darkness came a muffled shot. Cassandra dove to the side as the bullet ricocheted off the wall. "Ambush!" Richard shouted, but it was too late. From the side tunnels emerged figures, men of the Order, dressed in black masks, smooth suits, weapons at the ready, and leading them, a familiar figure. Dexter froze. No, it can't be. From the shadows stepped a man, someone Dexter had once called a friend. "I'm sorry, Dex," he said, "but the game is over." And Dexter realized he had been betrayed. A loud crash echoes through the dark chamber. The sound reverberates off the high-vaulted ceiling, dissipating into the heavy silence. Joel writhes on the cold floor, blood trickling from his split lip. Standing over him is Wallace, the one who had been playing a double game all along. "You dug too deep into the past." His voice is calm, almost indifferent. "You should have stopped sooner." Lauren's heart pounds so loudly it seems audible in the stillness. Her wrists are bound tightly by steel handcuffs, the metal biting into her skin. She stares at Wallace, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you do this?" Wallace smirks, casually sitting on the edge of the table as if he has all the time in the world. "Because I don't believe you can change this world, Lauren. No one can." At the far end of the chamber stand figures in dark robes, their faces concealed by hoods. One of them steps forward, revealing the face of a man in his 50s. Lauren recognizes him, Henry Archibald, one of the most influential figures in the Order. "You tried to outsmart us," he says, his voice devoid of anger or triumph, only cold understanding. "But we are always one step ahead." Joel struggles to rise, propping himself up on his elbows, but Wallace kicks him down again, giving him no chance to recover. "You know why we're here, Lauren," Archibald continues. "Hand over the seal, and you will be spared." Lauren's fingers clench into a fist. In the pocket of her jacket lies a small black stone plaque, engraved with symbols. The key to power, the key to the future. She knows she cannot give it to them, but she has no choice. "You want the truth?" Her voice rings out, cutting through the sound of rain outside the window. "Then listen." And she takes a step forward. Screams. Gunshots. Clouds of smoke fill the room, turning everything into chaos. Lauren dodges a blow, her fingers sliding over the cold metal of the pistol she managed to draw from her waistband. "Run!" Joel shouts, pushing one of the guards away. But she doesn't run. Her gaze meets Wallace's. "You made your choice," she whispers, leveling the gun at him. He doesn't move. Time stands still. And in that moment, someone grabs her shoulder and pulls her back. The shot rings out, but the bullet misses. Her hand trembles. "This isn't the end, Lauren." Wallace's voice is calm. But in his eyes there is something akin to regret. The seal is clutched tightly in her hand, and in the next instant, darkness envelops her. Lauren comes to in a speeding car, the night landscape rushing past the windows. Joel is behind the wheel, blood dripping from his temple, but he pays it no mind. His eyes are fixed on the road ahead, filled with determination. "We made it out." His voice trembles with exhaustion, but Lauren says nothing. She stares at the seal in her hands. This isn't the end. She knows the Order will continue their pursuit. That Wallace won't give up, that ahead lies only a new phase of the struggle, and she accepts it. The highway stretches into the darkness. Headlights of passing cars flash by. But in her mind, only one question echoes. What if this entire struggle is part of a plan she is yet to unravel?